The house that once belonged to Peter Ustinov sat quietly on a lush, tree-lined street in the heart of London, a place where history seemed to seep from the very walls. The house, a beautiful Georgian manor with a sprawling garden and rich, dark wood interiors, had been home to the celebrated actor, director, and writer until his death in 2004. After he passed, the estate was sold, and for many years no one seemed to stay for long. It wasn't until the summer of 2022 that a young couple, Claire and Ben, moved in. Claire, an up-and-coming novelist, and Ben, a successful architect, were drawn to the house by its charm and history. They had always admired Ustinov's wit and wisdom, so the thought of living in his former home felt almost like a dream come true. The couple had no idea what awaited them. From the moment they set foot inside, something felt off. The house, despite its beauty, had a peculiar atmosphere. The air was thick, as if it held the weight of decades of memories. At first, they chalked it up to the house's age, but as the days passed, Claire began to notice subtle, almost unexplainable occurrences. It started with the mirrors. At night, when she would walk past the large mirror in the hallway, she'd swear she saw a figure standing in the reflection. The first time it happened, she thought it was just a trick of the light, but it happened again and again. The figure was always the same. An older man with a round face and a sharp suit. She would turn around, but the hallway would be empty. Ben, too, began to experience strange things. He would hear soft footsteps in the middle of the night, pacing in the corridor outside their bedroom. At first, he thought it was the house settling, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. One night, he decided to investigate. He crept out of bed and walked through the long hallways, his heart pounding with each step. When he reached the living room, he found nothing but the still, empty space. It was Claire who first discovered the journals. While cleaning the study, she found a small wooden chest hidden behind a bookshelf. Inside were a series of leather-bound journals, each one filled with Ustinov's elegant handwriting. The entries were mostly about his travels, his work, and his musings on life. But there was one journal that struck Claire as odd. It was darker, filled with disjointed thoughts about the presence in the house, his growing discomfort, and strange encounters that left him unsettled. The final entry was dated just days before his death, describing a vision of a man standing by the window, watching him. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that Ustinov's ghost still lingered, trapped in the walls of his beloved home. As the days went on, the occurrences became more intense. Doors would open by themselves, lights flickered at odd times, and Claire felt an overwhelming sense of being watched, especially when she was alone in the house. Ben was skeptical at first, brushing it off as her imagination running wild, but he couldn't explain the things he was witnessing either. Then, one evening, as the couple sat in the living room, the air turned cold. The temperature dropped drastically, and Claire saw the figure in the mirror again. This time, it wasn't just a reflection. She saw him standing behind her, his eyes fixed on her with a penetrating gaze. Terrified, she turned around, but the room was empty. Ben, now visibly shaken, admitted that he had seen the same figure standing in the garden late one night, a tall man with a cane, walking slowly towards the house before disappearing into the mist. The final straw came when they were hosting a dinner party with friends. As they gathered in the dining room, the lights suddenly went out, plunging the room into darkness. When they flicked the switch, a soft voice, deep and old, whispered from the shadows, "You cannot leave." Everyone in the room froze, looking around in confusion, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to have come from the walls themselves, reverberating through the very foundation of the house. Claire and Ben made the difficult decision to leave. They reached out to a historian who had studied Ustinov's life and the house extensively. According to him, Ustinov had always been deeply connected to the house, spending countless hours there in solitude. He was known to have said that the house spoke to him, and over the years, it seemed to have grown even more sentient, as if the house itself held onto the spirit of its former owner. When the historian mentioned that the house was believed to be haunted by Ustinov's restless spirit, Claire and Ben realized they weren't just dealing with the echoes of a bygone era. They were living in a house that had never truly let go of its past. The couple sold the house a few months later, but the new owners, a wealthy family from abroad, moved in with their eyes wide open. They knew the history of the house and had been fascinated by the tales of Ustinov's ghost. As of now, they have yet to report any unusual occurrences. But those who visit the house often speak of a strange unease in the air, something that lingers, waiting, in the silence between moments. No one can say for sure whether Ustinov's ghost still roams the halls, but many believe it does. After all, some spirits never truly leave the places they love the most. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. It had been 4 months since Claire and Ben left the house, but the silence that settled within its high-ceilinged rooms was far from peaceful. The manor, with its heavy velvet curtains and faint scent of old wood and tobacco, seemed to breathe again. The walls, once disturbed by the movement and chatter of new life, now returned to their familiar stillness. Yet beneath that stillness, something stirred. The family who purchased the house in late winter were the Karslakes. Julian, a Swiss financier with an austere disposition, his wife Mireille, a French art dealer whose entire world seemed to rest behind the dark veil of her sunglasses, and their teenage daughter, Annette. They were not dreamers like Claire and Ben. The Karslakes didn't seek charm or nostalgia. They sought investment, prestige, and the credibility that came with owning a piece of London's history. Ustinov's house, with its lineage and whispers, was the perfect acquisition. Julian was the first to fall in love with the office. The room was located on the second floor, its walls still lined with dark walnut bookcases and its original fireplace intact. The ceiling bore a carved plaster medallion, and the long windows opened onto the garden where ivy climbed the stone boundary wall like it had done for over a century. It was the kind of room one expected to write essays in, heavy, contemplative, and rich with time. He moved in immediately, setting up his laptop at the same antique desk Ustinov had used, which remained part of the sale due to its historical significance. But there was something about that room, especially after sunset, that made Mireille uneasy. Though she was not prone to superstition, she claimed the shadows shifted in strange ways there, pooling unnaturally near the bookshelves, receding with unnatural grace when the door was opened. Julian dismissed her concerns. He worked late most nights, often well past midnight, and claimed no disturbances. Still, Mireille never stepped into the room alone. Annette, on the other hand, developed an unusual attachment to the piano room on the ground floor. It was a narrow chamber with faded olive wallpaper and a Steinway that had been left behind, said to have been a favorite of Ustinov's for moments of idle creativity. The girl wasn't particularly gifted musically, but she began spending long hours seated at the piano, playing slow, dissonant chords that never quite formed into music. Mireille noticed the change first. Her daughter, who had always been expressive and playful, grew increasingly withdrawn. She spoke less. She stopped painting. She began sleeping with her bedroom window open, even on cold nights. When asked why, she simply said, "He likes the air to move." At night, the house grew louder. What had once been the distant creaks of an aging home became unmistakable. Footfalls on the landing, a low hum that traveled through the heating vents, and the sound of muffled voices, foreign, unintelligible whispering beneath the floorboards. The staff began to complain. The housekeeper, a soft-spoken woman from Devon, resigned without notice after a month, claiming she saw a man in the mirror outside the master bedroom, a man who was not her reflection. Julian remained unmoved by these stories. He was a man of finance, of probabilities and concrete answers, and did not entertain irrational theories. But even he could not explain why the clocks in the house refused to keep time. Every timepiece, digital or analog, slowed down inexplicably within days. The large grandfather clock in the entryway, once restored and reliable, began to tick in reverse every night between 3 o'clock and 4 a.m. Electricians came and went, shrugged their shoulders, and told him the house had wiring beyond reason. Mireille began digging into the house's history in secret. She visited the British Library, scouring archives for mentions of Ustinov's final years. She found interviews, forgotten letters, and personal essays. One letter in particular, sent to a close friend shortly before his death, struck her like a slap. "Sometimes I feel I'm being written into my own script. The house knows my name when I forget it myself." Then came the night Annette collapsed. It was a Wednesday. Rain had been falling steadily since morning, painting the windows with long diagonal streaks. Mireille found her daughter lying face down on the floor of the piano room, her fingers frozen in midair, as though she had been reaching for a note. When Mireille shook her, Annette opened her eyes and began to weep, not from pain, but from something deeper. "He's sad," she whispered. "He doesn't know who he is anymore." That was the first time the Karslakes called someone in. Not a priest, not a medium, but an academic, Dr. Siona Clark, a professor of folklore and historical hauntings, known for her sober, unsensational approach to spiritual disturbances. When she arrived, she asked to walk through the house alone, recording as she went. She took nothing with her but a notebook and a small audio recorder. She stayed inside for 3 hours. When she returned to the sitting room where the family waited, her face was pale, her eyes distant. She said nothing for a long while, then turned to Julian and said quietly, "He's not trying to harm you. He doesn't know he's still here." Before she could explain further, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. All three of them turned toward the hallway, where a cold wind blew through the house, even though every door and window had been shut. A book fell from the second-floor landing open at the foot of the stairs. It was one of Ustinov's journals. And inside, underlined twice in red ink, was a sentence written shakily, as though the writer had been struggling to stay conscious. "I am losing the thread the house is writing me now." Dr. Clark bent down and picked up the journal with reverence. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was watching. Mireille insisted that Annette sleep in their room that night. She and Julian moved a mattress to the corner of the master bedroom, lit a series of beeswax candles, and left every door open, something they had never done before. Mireille also placed a small bronze crucifix on the nightstand, not out of religious conviction, but instinct. She couldn't explain it. Something ancient inside her told her to bring a symbol into the room, even if she didn't fully believe in its power. Annette lay quietly between them, her eyes open, staring at the coffered ceiling. Her breathing was shallow, deliberate. She hadn't spoken since that afternoon, when she whispered that he was sad. Julian sat in an armchair by the window, his laptop resting and used on his knees. He wasn't reading. He wasn't working. He was simply watching the hall through the reflection in the glass. Something had shifted in him, not belief. Not yet, but a hesitation had crept into his certainty. That silence, that thick, endless silence of the house at night, had begun to speak to him in ways he couldn't ignore. At exactly 2:43 a.m., Annette sat up. She didn't gasp. She didn't speak. She simply lifted herself as if pulled by a string, her long hair falling across her face in thin waves. Mireille stirred, sitting up beside her. "Nettie," she whispered, "what is it?" The girl's eyes were glassy, but she was awake. "He's standing in the gallery," Annette said calmly. "He's watching the garden." Julian was already moving, slipping his feet into slippers and throwing on a wool robe. He didn't look at his wife as he left the room, only nodded toward her. Mireille rose, wrapped herself in a shawl, and followed. They moved down the hall together, past the oil portraits of former owners, their faces caught forever in strokes of melancholy and prestige. Their footsteps made no sound on the old rug, as if the floor had learned not to betray the living. The gallery stretched along the rear of the second floor. It was one of the house's finest features. Tall arched windows, dark wooden floorboards, and a ceiling painted with faded murals of mythological scenes: Apollo driving the sun, Athena with her owl, Dionysus with a chalice, nearly invisible now behind decades of dust and smoke. Julian stepped to the farthest window. For a long moment, there was only the wind brushing across the ivy outside. The garden was empty, but then Mireille placed a hand on the cold glass. There he was, a man, standing near the center of the lawn, half in shadow, half in moonlight. Tall, slightly hunched, with one hand resting on what looked like a cane, the other at his side. He wasn't moving. His silhouette was unmistakable, not just a man, but a man who belonged to another time. His posture was theatrical, almost staged, as if frozen in an act of deep reflection. Julian opened the window. The cold hit them immediately. London spring. Sharp and wet, but there was no wind. Just silence. The figure turned. Not fully. Not dramatically. Just a tilt of the head, as though acknowledging someone who had been waiting too long to be noticed. Mireille gasped, not from fear, but something else, a recognition. The man's face was obscured in darkness, but there was a weight to his presence. Tiredness. Something brittle and unfinished. Then he was gone. No movement. No vanishing act. He simply ceased to be. The garden remained still, the hedges gently swaying. Julian said nothing. He didn't close the window. Behind them, Annette stood in the doorway of the gallery, barefoot in her nightgown. "He's looking for the ending," she said, her voice flat. "He never wrote the ending. He doesn't know how to leave." Mireille turned. "What do you mean, sweetheart? What ending?" Annette looked at the mural on the ceiling, eyes lingering on the faded sun god. "He thought he was the writer, but the house writes too. It edits, rearranges. When you stay too long, you become a scene." Dr. Siona Clark returned 2 days later. She brought with her a series of documents, blueprints of the house going back to the 1800s, transcriptions of interviews with other owners, and one photograph, faded and curling at the corners, of Peter Ustinov himself sitting in the very room Julian had claimed for his study. His smile in the image was strained, his eyes distant, as though caught mid-thought. Behind him, just barely visible in the polished surface of the bookshelf glass, stood a man in the shadows. Too blurred to make out, but there. Unmistakably there. "The house doesn't haunt in the traditional sense," Dr. Clark said over tea, her voice low, measured. "It's more like a memory loop. It absorbs personalities, behaviors, regrets, especially regrets. That's what lingers." She placed the photo on the table between them. "I think Ustinov left something behind. Not just his spirit, but a story he never finished. And now the house is trying to write it for him, using whoever walks its halls." Julian scoffed. "You make it sound like the house is alive." Dr. Clark looked up at him, one brow raised. "Maybe not alive, but certainly sentient." Mireille leaned forward, her voice barely audible. "What happens when it finishes writing?" Clark didn't answer. She only looked at Annette, who, from the window seat, was staring again at the garden, as if reading something the rest of them couldn't see, something unfolding word by word. The final days in the house came quietly, like the slow dying of a fire. Not with drama, not with chaos, just a gentle unraveling of what remained tethered to the real. Mireille woke often in the night to the sound of footsteps. Not loud, not sudden, just deliberate, thoughtful, as if someone were rehearsing a scene. The smell of pipe smoke began to linger in the study even when no one entered it. The curtains sometimes moved as if caught in a breeze, though the windows were shut. Books she'd shelved would be found on the table, open, sometimes annotated in handwriting that wasn't Julian's. Annette no longer slept in her room. She stayed in the garden now during the day, sitting near the stone bench under the sycamore tree, sketching with a pencil and pad. Her drawings had changed. They were no longer moody landscapes or unfinished portraits. They were architectural plans. Rooms that didn't exist. Halls that curved inward like coiled paper. Staircases that began in midair and ended in darkness. She said she was dreaming of them. One morning, Mireille followed the girl into the gallery and found her holding a drawing against the light. On the page, the main staircase of their home, but every step was filled with faces. Blurred, partial, all turned toward a single figure at the top, who seemed to glow faintly at the edges, as if lit from within. Annette looked up at her mother and whispered, "He finished it." That night, the house breathed. It began with a deep groan from the foundation, like the settling of an old man's spine. The floorboards in the gallery trembled. The grandfather clock in the foyer began to chime, though the hands stood at 3:12. Not midnight, not dawn, just an arbitrary hour, as though time had stopped adhering to sequence. Julian had gone back to the study. He sat there at Ustinov's desk, a decanter of scotch untouched beside him. In his lap, the old journal that had fallen from the landing weeks before. He'd spent the last 3 days reading it again, tracing each word, each ink blot, each frantic line scratched in haste. What struck him wasn't the content, it was the rhythm. The way the handwriting had changed over time, from confident loops to erratic, almost frantic scrawls. The descent wasn't into madness. It was into helplessness. Ustinov wasn't trying to escape the house. He was trying to surrender to it, to become a part of it, to finish his life not with an ending, but as a final paragraph in the structure of the house itself. The study door creaked open. Annette entered, barefoot, holding one of her drawings. She placed it gently in front of her father. It was the house again, but the rooms were inverted walls folding in on themselves, like the house was collapsing inward into its own memory. Julian looked at her. "Where did you see this?" "I didn't see it," she said. "I was it." In the hallway, the lights dimmed. Mireille, who had been standing near the foyer, stepped back as a cold current swept through the entrance like the breath of an open crypt. She turned toward the stairwell, and for just a second, there he was. Peter Ustinov. Not aged, not deteriorated, but younger, perhaps in his 50s, with his signature scarf slung carelessly over his shoulder, hands in his coat pockets. He looked at her, eyes gentle, not menacing. But there was a sadness in him that seemed to echo down the length of the hallway like a cello note. He nodded once, and then turned toward the wall and walked straight into it. No resistance, no sound, just gone. That was the moment the house sighed. Every door in the manor unlatched with a soft click. Windows opened an inch. Curtains fluttered outward. The grandfather clock stopped chiming, and the pendulum came to rest at center. The air lightened. Upstairs, in the study, Julian looked at the journal one last time. The last page had changed. No ink had been added, but the words had rearranged themselves. What once read, "I am losing the thread the house is writing me now," now said, "I have given the thread the house will remember me." He exhaled. 2 weeks later they left. No press release. No grand explanation. The Karslakes simply packed their belongings, boarded a plane to Lausanne, and listed the house through a quiet private agent. They left behind only the Steinway and the grandfather clock, as requested in the terms of the original sale. For some time the house stood empty again. But the neighbors say they've seen a light in the gallery window, sometimes around 3 in the morning. And sometimes on very quiet nights music drifts out through the open windows. Not a song, not a melody, just the slow, searching press of piano keys, as though someone were still trying to find the right final note. And in the study, if you look closely at the desk, you'll see that someone, perhaps Ustinov, perhaps the house itself, has carved something under the lip of the wood, where only a seated person would ever notice it. 5 words, faint, scratched by hand. No story ever truly ends. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.